My husband told me he was working overtime every night. Then a stranger sent me one photo, and the woman standing next to him was wearing my wedding ring. I stared at the image until my coffee turned cold between my hands. There he was, my husband, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. One arm rested comfortably around a woman in a black dress. But it wasn't his smile that stole the air from my lungs. It was her left hand. The diamond I'd worn every day for 11 years. Caught the afternoon sunlight with the same tiny chip along one side, the same platinum band engraved with our initials and our anniversary date. There was no mistaking it. I knew every flaw in that ring because I'd spent over a decade tracing it with my thumb, whenever life became too heavy. The message came from an unknown number. I thought you deserved to know. Nothing else? No threats? No explanation. Just the photograph. Outside my kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass while the washing machine hummed in the next room, still cleaning the shirts he claimed were stained from late nights at the office. I looked at the clock. 6:43 p.m. In exactly 17 minutes. My husband would walk through the front door, smelling of expensive cologne buried beneath fake exhaustion. He would kiss my forehead, loosen his tie, and apologize for another impossible day at work, just like he had every night for the last 4 months. I should have screamed. I should have called him. Instead, I zoomed in. His watch reflected the name of the restaurant in the window behind them. The woman leaned against him with effortless confidence, as if she belonged there. As if she belonged beside my husband. And on her finger sat the one thing he had promised would never leave my hand. The funny thing about betrayal is that the loudest sound isn't shouting. It's silence. The silence that settles over a room after the truth arrives. The silence that replaces every excuse you've ever believed. By the time I heard his key slide into the front lock, I had already wiped my tears away. I folded the photo into my memory with the precision of someone filing evidence. Not heartbreak. When he stepped inside wearing his practiced smile, he apologized for working overtime before I even asked. I smiled back. Not because I forgave him. Because for the first time since we were married, I knew something he didn't. And that changed everything. I'd always believed that trust wasn't something you declared. It was something you practiced in ordinary moments. For 12 years, I practiced it without hesitation. I remembered his coffee order, the passwords he could never keep straight, the way he hated driving in the rain. I built my life around the quiet assumption that we were carrying the same future. Even when the weight wasn't evenly shared, my name rarely appeared in the stories people told about our marriage. Friends described him as ambitious, charming, the man who worked so hard for his family. I was simply the dependable wife who made everything else look effortless. The meals appeared on the table, birthdays were remembered, bills were paid before they became problems, and somehow none of it counted as work. I never demanded applause. I only expected honesty. Looking back, I can see how invisible I had slowly become. Whenever I questioned another late night or another canceled dinner, he answered with patient smiles that made me feel unreasonable instead of concerned. Before long, I started apologizing for asking perfectly normal questions. That was his greatest talent. He never argued loudly enough to seem guilty. He simply nudged reality until I questioned my own instincts. I wasn't weak. I was loyal. There's a difference, though people often confuse the two. My father used to tell me that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who lie. Convincingly, they're the ones who make you feel guilty for noticing the lie. I understood those words far too late. What my husband never understood was that silence had always been my strongest habit. While other people reacted, I observed. While they defended themselves, I remembered details. He mistook my calm for blindness because I rarely interrupted, rarely accused, rarely raised my voice. He thought that if I wasn't making a scene, I wasn't paying attention. He couldn't have been more wrong. By the time that stranger's photograph reached my phone, I wasn't just looking at one act of betrayal. I was finally seeing every small crack. He'd spent years convincing me didn't exist. The photograph didn't create suspicion. It simply gave a face to the feeling I'd been living with for months. The changes had been almost too small to question. He stopped asking how my day had been, replacing conversation with distracted nods while scrolling through his phone. If I cooked his favorite meal, he barely noticed. If I wore a new dress, his eyes passed over me as though familiarity had erased the need to look. At dinner, his phone began resting face down beside his plate. When it vibrated, he would glance at the screen for half a second before excusing himself with an absent smile. "Work," he always said. Never another explanation. I noticed the pauses that didn't belong. The extra shower before bed. The expensive cologne on nights he claimed he'd been buried in paperwork. The faint outline where his wedding band should have been whenever he returned home, followed by the casual way he slipped it back on before walking through the front door. One evening, I reached across the table to hold his hand. He looked surprised. Not guilty, just inconvenienced. His fingers pulled away under the excuse of answering another message. That tiny movement hurt more than any argument could have. A week later, we attended a neighborhood barbecue. He introduced me with effortless politeness, yet spent the evening laughing with strangers, while forgetting to refill my empty glass. More than once, I caught him checking his reflection in the patio windows instead of looking for me. People noticed his charm. No one noticed my silence. He had mastered the art of disrespect that left no bruises, forgotten, anniversaries disguised as work emergencies, compliments for everyone except his wife, promises postponed until they quietly disappeared. Each slight was too ordinary to defend. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. By the time I received that anonymous photograph, I wasn't mourning the marriage I thought I had. I was mourning the woman who had spent months convincing herself that crumbs were enough, while the man she trusted had already decided she would never look closely enough to notice the feast he was sharing with someone else. The turning point didn't come with another photograph. It arrived 3 nights later, in the quietest moment imaginable. He had fallen asleep on the couch, still dressed in the same shirt he'd claimed was wrinkled from another impossible day at the office. The television flickered across the room, casting pale blue light over his face. For the first time in years, I looked at him without searching for the man I had married. I saw a stranger. His phone lit up on the coffee table. One message. Can't wait until she finally believes all the overtime. Tonight was perfect. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The preview was enough. For a few seconds, I stood perfectly still, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. It amazed me how peacefully someone could sleep while another person's reality collapsed beside them. Then something unexpected happened. The pain stopped growing. It didn't disappear, but it settled into something sharper, clearer. I realized I had been waiting for a confession that would never come. He wasn't going to wake up ashamed. He wasn't trapped in a mistake. He was protecting a choice he had made over and over again. That understanding changed everything. I walked into my home office and opened a folder on my laptop. For months, I'd been saving small pieces without admitting why. Copies of bank statements, unusual credit card charges, hotel receipts emailed by mistake, calendar entries that contradicted his stories, screenshots of messages he thought he'd deleted from our shared tablet. At the time, I told myself I was looking for reassurance. Now I understood I had been collecting evidence. I wasn't planning a dramatic confrontation. No shattered plates. No screaming across the kitchen. People like my husband expected anger because anger burns fast. They rarely prepare for patience. As dawn crept through the windows, I made a decision that felt less like revenge and more like reclaiming my own life. He had spent months writing a story in which I never noticed. I was about to write the ending myself, and he wouldn't see it coming until every page had already turned. The next morning, I behaved exactly as I always had. I packed his lunch, reminded him about the dry cleaning, and kissed his cheek before he left for another late shift. He smiled with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was controlling the story. That confidence became my greatest advantage. I took a week's vacation from work without telling anyone except my manager. Every morning after he left, I treated my marriage like a business audit instead of a heartbreak. Emotions stayed outside the room. Facts stayed inside. I met quietly with a family law attorney. I didn't ask how to punish my husband. I asked how to protect myself. The difference mattered. The attorney explained exactly which financial records to copy, which accounts to monitor, and which decisions should wait until everything was properly documented. Every conversation was practical, measured, and focused on preserving evidence rather than creating conflict. Back home, I organized everything into labeled folders: bank statements, property documents, retirement accounts, insurance policies, credit card transactions. I compared dates against his overtime claims and found a pattern so consistent it almost looked scheduled. Expensive dinners appeared on evenings he'd insisted the office cafeteria was his only option. Hotel charges lined up perfectly with the nights he claimed to be finishing major projects. Each discovery removed another excuse. I changed none of my routines. I still answered his texts with warmth. I still listened when he complained about imaginary deadlines. The only difference was that I had stopped believing him. He mistook my kindness for ignorance. In reality, I was giving him exactly what he wanted, a wife who asked no difficult questions, while quietly making sure every answer he would eventually need was already waiting in a neatly organized file. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to his lies. I was preparing for the moment when the truth would speak for itself. I chose a Tuesday. Nothing about it looked important. He left the house at 7:15 that morning with the same casual wave, the same promise that he'd be working late again. By noon, every document had already been signed, copied, and delivered exactly where it needed to be. My attorney filed the paperwork. The bank received updated instructions on my individual accounts. The locksmith finished replacing the locks before sunset. Not one step required raised voices. Only timing. That evening, I set the dining table for one. I cooked my favorite meal instead of his, opened a bottle of sparkling water, and ate slowly while soft rain tapped against the windows. It was the first peaceful dinner I'd had in months. At 8:43 p.m., my phone buzzed. Running late. Don't wait up. Love you. I looked at the message for a long moment before placing the phone face down. Those 3 words, love you, felt almost rehearsed. At 10:17, the doorbell rang. Through the camera, I watched him standing on the porch, confusion replacing confidence as his key failed to turn the lock. He tried again, then checked the house number as if he had somehow come to the wrong address. Only then did he notice the envelope taped neatly beside the door. Inside were copies of the divorce papers, a list of the financial records I had preserved, and a single handwritten note. You never lost me because she was better. You lost me the moment you believed I'd never notice. I watched him read it twice. His shoulders, always so perfectly straight, slowly sank. Then his phone lit up. He reached for it instinctively, probably searching for an excuse, an explanation, or someone to rescue him from the consequences he had spent months creating. For the first time since that anonymous photograph arrived, I felt no anger, only stillness. He stood outside a house that was no longer his home, holding the truth he had worked so hard to hide. I turned off the porch light, not to punish him, simply because there was nothing left for either of us to see. The days that followed were remarkably quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations, no angry scenes on the front lawn. Instead, there were phone calls he couldn't avoid and conversations he could no longer control. Family members who had once admired our perfect marriage slowly discovered that the overtime stories had never existed outside his imagination. No one needed my version first. The facts spoke before I did. When friends reached out, I refused to insult him or recount every betrayal. I simply told the truth when asked and left the rest untouched. It surprised people how powerful honesty became once it no longer competed with excuses. Some drifted away, uncomfortable with the collapse of the image they had believed. Others quietly apologized for all the times they'd told me. I was lucky to have such a devoted husband. The apology I cared about most never came from anyone else. It came from myself. One morning, I caught my reflection while locking the front door. For months, I had seen a woman searching for reasons to stay. That morning, I saw someone who had finally stopped negotiating with disrespect. The marriage ended. So did the constant doubt that had followed me through every unanswered question and every lonely dinner. His reputation didn't fall apart because I destroyed it. It unraveled because it had been stitched together with lies that could only survive in silence. As for me, I learned something I wish I had understood years earlier. Self-respect rarely arrives with applause. Sometimes it begins with a single quiet decision to believe what your own eyes have already seen. That's why this story matters. Not because revenge is satisfying, but because the greatest victory isn't watching someone lose what they took for granted. It's refusing to lose yourself while they do. 6 months later, I walked into a smaller home with fewer rooms and far more peace. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. I planted herbs on the kitchen windowsill, painted the spare bedroom the soft blue I'd always wanted, and discovered that an ordinary Tuesday could be beautiful when it wasn't filled with waiting. I no longer listened for keys in the front door or rehearsed conversations that would end in another carefully polished lie. My life became wonderfully predictable. I began saying yes to invitations I had once declined. I reconnected with old friends without checking whether it fit someone else's schedule. On quiet weekends, I drove with the windows down, letting fresh air replace memories that no longer deserved space inside me. People occasionally asked if I hated him. The answer surprised even me. I didn't. Hate would have kept me tied to a chapter that was already over. What I felt instead was gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for the clarity it forced upon me. The anonymous photograph had not ruined my marriage. It had revealed that the marriage had already been broken long before I knew it. As for my ex-husband, I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances. His explanations changed depending on the audience. Some believed him, others didn't. Eventually, I stopped caring enough to ask. That was the real ending, not the divorce, not the signed papers, not the locked front door. The ending came the day his choices stopped occupying space in my mind. Sometimes I still think about that wedding ring. For years, I believed it represented the promises he made to me. Now I understand it represented something much more important, the promises I should have made to myself. To never mistake silence for acceptance, to never confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice, and to never ignore the quiet voice inside me simply because someone else speaks louder. The greatest revenge was never watching him lose me. It was watching myself become someone who would never settle for being lost again.